Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hasquin, and I'm back doing some of those social studies teachers things with things you should know by being alive. And today I want to talk about an event and a case where we see an important impact on the civil rights movement in the United States and also an important Supreme Court case. So this is also an important political event. And today I want to talk about the case of La Amistad, or the Amistad case. So let's give it a shot. So this takes us back antebellum, so this is pre-Civil War, and in 1839 there was a group of Africans that were kidnapped from Sierra Leone, and they were sold in Cuba at Havana in violation of international law banning the slave trade in the Southern Hemisphere. They were placed on the Amistad, La Amistad, a Spanish ship, and were bound for plantations farther on in Cuba. Among them was a kidnapped captive named Sengbe Pia, and he became known as Joseph Chinque. And he would emerge as the leader of a fight for freedom for himself and for those others who survived the trip with him. When the Amistad set sail, the men and women aboard fought back, and they refused to remain enslaved. So on July 1st of 1839, Chinque led a rebellion on the Amistad. There had been a file found, and Chinque was able to use it to free himself, and they were able to get on deck, and they used sugarcane knives that were on the ship to free themselves. They killed the captain of the ship and the cook, and they ordered the crew to take them back to Sierra Leone, to take them back to Africa. But the surviving crew was deceptive, sneaky false. They deceived them, and they sailed north and west instead. And after 2 months of sailing up the eastern seaboard of the United States, the precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard was it was the Cutter Revenue Service or something along those lines, seized the ship near Long Island, New York. The captives were then imprisoned in Connecticut, and they were charged with piracy and faced murder charges, also, which would lead them to potential death sentences. So, this case electrifies the abolitionist movement because there's a couple things going on here. One, slavery is illegal in New York. Some of these revenue agents knew that, and so instead they had the slaves taken to Connecticut, where technically slavery was still legal on the books. But the international slave trade was illegal in the United States since 1808 because of a 20-year window that had been closed after the ratification of the Constitution. And so slave trade could remain legal inside the United States, but you could not import slaves from outside. Now, of course, illegal slave trade from international sources still took place, but let's go on here with the story. So now, like I said, this case, just electrified the abolitionist movement in the United States. So Northern abolitionists, including a man named Lewis Tappan, created a group known as the Amistad Committee, and they wanted to raise funds to organize a legal defense of the captives of the Amistad. Church groups, black communities, and activists all rallied together, seeing the Amistad captives as symbols of the anti-slavery cause. And so for the public, it became a test about freedom versus property, human rights versus the entrenched system of slavery. So let's look at the leader of the revolt that brings the captives into this situation in the United States. Joseph Chinque was born as Sengbe Pia in Sierra Leone sometime around 1814. He was kidnapped, sold, and endured the horrors of the Middle Passage from Africa across the Atlantic, making his way into the Caribbean, into Cuba. On the Amistad, Chinque became the organizer and spiritual leader of the revolt. Eyewitnesses described him with a sense of dignity and determination that took place throughout the trial, several trials that took place. Now, he learned English in prison. He spoke about freedom, and he became a symbol of resistance and humanity. His image appeared in abolitionist pamphlets, speeches, fundraising materials, inspiring a lot of anti-slavery folks in the North. Now, the U.S. government, under President Martin Van Buren, sided with the Spanish government in this particular situation. They both argued that the captives from the Amistad should be returned to Spanish control. But there's a key question here, and that was whether the Africans were slaves or free people under international law. The British government said, hey, these people were illegally kidnapped. They were brought from the southern hemisphere where the slave trade is illegal internationally, so therefore they should be freed. Lower courts in this case ruled in favor of the captives, stating they were illegally enslaved and they should be returned to Africa. And President Van Buren should make sure that that happens. But the United States government continued to appeal from the district court in Connecticut to the Court of Appeals, and eventually it lands in the Supreme Court in 1841. So, this is where we see a unique circumstance. At 73 years old, former President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, argues for the captives before the Supreme Court. He delivers a 9-hour defense over several days for the captives of the Amistad. And he said during the defense, the moment you come to the Declaration of Independence, that every man has a right to life, liberty, and inalienable right, this case is decided. Adams condemned the hypocrisy of a nation founded on liberty while also enslaving human beings. He argued that Cinque and the others were justified in fighting for their freedom. It was their right because these were natural-born rights. His emotional, powerful speech left an impression on the court and also the country. This case was being followed by newspapers around the United States. Now, on March 9th of 1841, the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in favor of the Amistad captives, declaring them to be free individuals. They had the right to fight for their liberty and were illegally enslaved under international law. In 1842, with abolitionist support, Cinque and 35 survivors returned to Sierra Leone, reuniting with their families and their communities. So, the legacy of the Amistad case. What does this bring about? Why is it relevant? Well, the Amistad case, one, became a rallying cry for abolitionists in America. Two, it demonstrated the power of activism, law, and individual courage. And it also, three, exposed contradictions in American democracy in that antebellum period before the Civil War. The story of Cinque, of John Quincy Adams, and the Amistad reminds us that freedom is often fought for by those denied it, and that their courage can change history. The Amistad wasn't just a legal case. It was a fight for freedom against impossible odds, led by those who refused to remain silent. If you picked up anything new about American history here with the Amistad case, hey, throw out a like, a comment, a follow, a share for more things that you should know by being alive. It comes down to, because stories like the Amistad show us what happens when people demand to be seen as human. I could also recommend the film Amistad by Steven Spielberg, starring Anthony Hopkins, Matthew McConaughey, and Morgan Freeman. I suggest it highly. But anyway, thanks for watching.